cast some lights, I think, and not shadows, on the development of the posterior fossa, because you are aware that the brain changed dramatically from the first trimester to postnatal life. All of us have told you so during our lectures. And this regards the vermis itself and the posterior fossa as well. The breaking news is that, it's not breaking news actually, it's just a good work, a good idea of Ashley Robinson from Vancouver. And he is one of the scientists who is very keen to look into the posterior fossa abnormalities, as we are. And he came out with an editorial on the White Journal, and the last issue of the White Journal, revisiting a few concepts regarding development of posterior fossa and proposing a new theory for the development of the vermis itself. And as such, this would involve a redefinition of the concept of inferior verminal hypoplasia, which again was the corresponding new term for identifying part of the Dandy-Walker variant, which is no longer to be used. So a few concepts regarding how the vermis itself is formed. So during the first week of life, during the formation of the dorsal pointing flexure, you see here, there is a transverse crease, and then you have the forming of the rhomboencephalic vesicles, which divides it into an anterior cranial and a posterior membranous area. So this is the main issue. Then from the anterior membranous area, which is corresponding to the rhomboelips, the vermis itself will develop, whereas the posterior membranous area will give way to the Blake's pouch cyst, as we will see afterwards. The quadriplexus develops in the crease that you see here. And another important issue, and this is going to be quite definitive, is that it seems that the cisterna magna itself, at this stage of development, forms just by cavitation, forming some bubbles of fluid within the connective tissue here, and there is not yet any communication whatsoever with the ventricles, and so it's not filled with the CSF so far. As the cerebellum grows inferiorly, the posterior membranous area bulges out, and this is the Blake's pouch, which is the normal transient structures of the posterior fossa, up to probably 10 to 12 weeks of gestation, but there is a question mark about this as well. And this will create the Blake's pouch. And you see here that the subarachnoid space remain trabeculated at this stage, since there is not yet a communication between the fourth ventricle and the cisterna magna. Only when and if the Blake's pouch cyst will perforate and fenestrate, again around the end of the first trimester apparently, then you will have a free communication of fluid between the fourth ventricle and the cisterna magna. And there are some also sonographic evidence for this to occur later on in gestation. And you see here that the quadriplexus, in this case, if it's indeed a Blake's pouch cyst, is on the upper wall of the cyst itself. It's not in the lowermost portion of it. With high-frequency transvaginal ultrasound, we may come near this period of gestation, and we may use a three-dimensional ultrasound to increase and enhance the resolution. And you see here that comparison with the drawing that I showed you before, actually you can see very nicely the forming brain, the forming posterior fossa, and this is the area we are more concerned with, which includes the membranous area of the forming developing vermis, and the quadriplexus, which is the hyperechoic structure that you see here in this midline section of the brain. So we are almost there to study the vermis itself and the posterior fossa when it is developing, which is between 7 and up to 14 weeks of gestation for this stage of development that I just mentioned. The second issue, which I mentioned to you in my introduction, which he proposed as a new theory for the formation of the and development of the vermis, is that so far we have always thought that the vermis is forming into an anteroposterior way, in this way that I showed you. And what he is proposing, based on a series of observation of data which are already out in the literature, and his own data as well, is that the vermis itself would not develop in this way, but rather in an anteroposterior way, in this way. It just grows up and goes from anterior to posterior. If you accept this theory, it goes by itself that you should not have such a lesion as inferior vermin hypoplasia. But what we have so far called inferior vermin hypoplasia would be, with a great question mark, actually whole vermin hypoplasia. Then we can discuss about this with Gustavo and Gianluigi and everybody who may wish to join the discussion if we are not too hypoglycemic to do so. So this is quite important for us to consider, because this is an important issue. So that the proposed theory is that the vermis formation does not go in this way, rather in that way. What about the cisterna magna? The cisterna magna develops by cavitation, then the Blake spot cyst fenestrate to create the foramen of Magendie, and then at this stage the cisterna magna itself fuses and receives the cerebrospinal fluid coming out from the former Blake spot cyst through the foramen of Magendie. This has been actually defined that the strands of tissue that we see on ultrasound, on actual views during the second trimester in the posterior fossa, are probably very likely to be remnants of the Blake spot cyst wall, which is no longer there to be seen because it has perforated in the meantime. So these are the basic concepts and news that I would like to bring to you regarding developments of the vermis, and this has something to do with the classification of abnormalities. The second issue is that how early we can go in the definition and detection of posterior fossa abnormalities beyond the IT, the nuchal translucency that you are very well aware of. The issue is that I think that Gustavo, they told me, showed you the possibility to predict agenesis of the corpus callosum in the first trimester. What is more clear to us is that sometimes, especially in very malformed fetuses such as this one, you may see that there is a wide collection of fluid in the posterior fossa. I brought you two multiplanar imaging to show you how it appears on axial, coronal, and sagittal view. These are two cases, one and another one, with a large collection of fluid, likely to be a Dandy Walker malformation or something of the kind. But our idea and recommendation, and probably this is shared with other researchers, is for these lesions we cannot make out one from the other at this early gestation. So we need to, and this is another case, in comparison with the normal appearance of the posterior fossa, 13 weeks of gestation. So we have still to follow this up at least to 17 weeks of gestation, when the more obvious abnormalities will be out there to be defined. And for more challenging diagnosis, we should wait until 19 weeks of gestation. This is another case in which there was exencephaly associated with an obvious Dandy Walker malformation. And now we come to what we are more familiar with, the four big malformations of the posterior fossa and the vermis, namely Dandy Walker malformation, Blake spot cyst, vermis hypoplasia or inferior vermis hypoplasia we do not know yet, and megacisterna magna. And very few, a reminder of very few concepts. Regarding the Dandy Walker malformation, you have three diagnostic features, all of them on mid-sagittal view of the brain. There is severe upward displacement of the insertion of the tentorium with a cystic posterior fossa. The vermis is very, very small. Sometimes it's agenetic, and if it's there, is completely rotated anticlockwise. And there is severe hypoplasia of the vermis itself. So on actual view, which is the screening view, you have the wide fluid collection in posterior fossa, and then you turn your transducer, you do the transvaginal scan, or anyway the mid-sagittal view, and you find out the elevation of the tentorium and the tiny, tiny and often hyperechoic vermis that you see here, which is very, very hypoplastic. And if you need, there is no need to carry out an MRI for such a diagnosis at this stage of pregnancy, but still, if you want to have it, it just reinforces the diagnosis. And if these cases are found out or continue their pregnancy, obviously there is obstructive hydrocephalus developing in the late gestation. The second abnormality is the inferior or, however, vermin hypoplasia. In this case, the collection of fluid in the cisterna magna is not increased. There is no elevation of the tentorium. There is anyway an hypoplasia which so far was thought to be involving only the lowermost portion of the vermis, and now we will have to see what comes out of this discussion, whether we move to a concept of a whole vermin hypoplasia and no longer inferior vermin hypoplasia or not. There is moderate upward rotation of the vermis itself, not as pronounced as in the Walker malformation, and there is a wide communication of fluid between the fourth ventricle and the cisterna magna that you see here. On ultrasound, on the screening view, you see here the keyhole sign, which is very typical not only of vermin hypoplasia, but also of Blake pouch cyst. So the differential diagnosis should be carried out on the mid-sagittal plane, as I'll show you in a while. And here is the diagnostic view. You see a very tiny vermis lifted up, wide collection of fluid, no elevation of the tentorium, but this is there is no fastigium to be seen here. And this is in comparison with a normal case for the same gestational age, the fastigium, the fourth ventricle, and the cisterna magna. And you see there is no evident communication between the two here. And this is another case with the MRI confirmation. You see here the hypoplastic vermis and the comparison with an MRI. The third anomaly I would like to expand a bit on is the Blake's pouch cyst. We have become aware that probably a good share of what we thought in the past be then the Walker variants are actually Blake's pouch cyst, because there was no hypoplasia of the vermis whatsoever. The pathogenetic mechanism is what I showed you before, so I will not lose time on this. If the Blake's pouch does not perforate at 10 to 14 weeks, then it will bulge out in this way, creating a digit-like cyst, which is actually the Blake's pouch cyst. And this will lift up the vermis, which by definition is normal anatomy-wise and size-wise, and so it's just a passive elevation of the vermis in case of a Blake's pouch cyst. So the vermis size is normal, and this is the key differential sign in comparison with the inferior vermin hypoplasia. There is a moderate upward rotation of the vermis itself, which is a passive issue. And third, there is a normal posterior fossa and a cyst. And sometimes I'll show you the images in a while. You may see actually the upper wall of the cyst. So the cyst will fill up part of the cisterna magna, but there is no communication between the fourth ventricle and Blake's pouch and the cisterna magna itself. And this is in comparison with inferior vermin hypoplasia. So the images and the concept that I will mention to you in a while are taken from this paper that you can download from free access from the White Journal. We assessed some 20 cases over the last years that came into our observation, and these are the criteria that we derived for such a diagnosis. The anatomy and the size of the vermis should be normal, so you should have some charts to confront with taking your measurements. This is one of the few available. There is, I think, Mallinger also published one, if I'm not wrong. There is, of course, the passive anticlockwise rotation of the vermis. The extent of this rotation is a bit less than for obvious malformations such as then the Walker malformation. and the size of the cisterna magna itself is normal. And you see here the fourth issue is that you may actually, if you're lucky and the images are good, see actually the roof of the Blake's pouch in the fourth ventricle, in the cisterna magna. And you see here the corresponding image. This is the Blake's pouch cyst. This is the upper wall, and this is a normal vermis with the primary fissure quite evident here. So the vermis itself is normal, and you can also get an idea of the fact that the fluid present in the cisterna magna is not as translucent as the one in the Blake's pouch cyst for the reasons I mentioned before. And I'll show you another coronal image in which this is more clear. Another issue is that if you see the panel of the images that we got for our series, you see that the angle that has been, this is the Ponto Vermian angle that you see here, may vary significantly also within the same type of pathology, which is Blake's pouch cyst. And this is the image I showed you before, and on the coronal view, reconstructed coronal view, you can actually see very nicely how the fluid within the Blake's pouch cyst is perfectly transonic because it's cerebrospinal fluid, and on the other hand, out of it, you still have the strands of collagen tissue within the cisterna magna because this has not yet fused with the axial system and the ventricular system to receive the cerebrospinal fluid. So this is a further confirmation of the two issues. First, that cisterna magna forms initially from cavitation and not as a axial and ventricular system structure, and the second one that in Blake's pouch cyst there is not yet the foramen of Magendie open. The other issue I would like to mention is that in these cases the numbers are very small, but it should be probably growing in the near future. In our experience, a good share of the pregnancy which reached term, there was a disappearance of the Blake's pouch cyst by the late second trimester of pregnancy. And this is probably due either to opening or late opening of the foramen of Magendie or to the opening of the foramen of Luschka, because one of the two papers which have dealt with in the past with the timing of opening of these foramina in the fetus claim that this appears roughly at 25 weeks, and this would be in fair agreement with the observation that we would done in these cases. And you see here two cases with different destiny. In this case, there was complete disappearance of the Blake's pouch with a perfectly unremarkable image in the third trimester neurosonography. You see no more evident the Blake's pouch here. On the other hand, in this case, the image was quite similar at 23 weeks and at 32 weeks of gestation. And probably these are the cases in which there is a risk for a postnatal hydrocephalus to develop obstructive hydrocephalus if the foramen of Luschka will not develop. This is a speculation. This is our speculation. We are trying to follow them up in our small series. So in summary, for the Blake's pouch cyst, you should remember that it's not a worrying and it is a good prognosis lesion because it involves the area membranosa inferior or posterior and not the anterior, and so does not contain neurons and does not affect the vermis itself. The most difficult differential diagnosis is with inferior vermin hypoplasia, and so you should just size up the vermis, just measure it, and see whether it is normal or not. It may fenestrate, so these cases should be followed up through gestation, and it may be associated with obstructive hydrocephalus postnatally. This is a speculation. Probably is Luschka foramina are absent, which occurs also in normal fetuses and neonates in a certain percentage of cases. And of course, by definition, considering the pathogenesis of this lesion, it is not associated with neurodevelopmental delay. Regarding the Ponto-Vermian angle that you see here, there has been a very nice paper by Gianluigi Group and Bologna and my friends and co-worker Paolo Volpe in Bari, and they actually measured this angle that you see here, and in their experience, in this way, there was a clear-cut definition between the good prognosis group and the relatively poorer prognosis group. We did not share the same experience, though our number of black spot cysts were limited, but still what can be said is that probably if this angle that you see here is relatively small, then the prognosis should be good, because maybe more the case to be a black spot cyst rather than a vermin hypoplasia. If it's larger, then it's more worrisome. And finally, Megacisterna magna. By definition, it designates a white cistern, which measure on the anteroposterior plane more than 10 millimeters from the edge of the vermis to the occipital bone that you see here, and by definition exerts no compression of the cerebellum. According to some authors, there is communication with the fourth ventricles, not according to other authors. There is a differential diagnosis issue if you use just the axial view for diagnosis, because you look at the fluid collection here, but it may be an arachnoid cyst, it may be a persistent though deflating black spot, or maybe also non-pertinent, non-belonging to the posterior fossa itself, but be, for example, a dural aneurysm. And again, you know what, to get the diagnosis, you should turn your transducer and get the sagittal view. If it's a true Megacisterna magna, there will be no membranes to be seen in the posterior fossa, and this is the three-dimensional and MRI. If it's a regressing Blake, you may have a normal vermis with no increase of the point of Riemann angle that you see here, but still you have this kind of cyst wall in the posterior fossa, which we think it's a deflating Blake spot. Or on some other occasion, this may look as a white cisterna magna, but there is some compression effect on the cerebellar hemispheres that you see here. And so in this case, it was an arachnoid cyst, and you see here the wall of the cyst itself. Of course, there is no doubt if the arachnoid cyst is so large as in this case, and you see here the mid-sagittal view as well, but on some other occasions, especially in the third trimester, you see here in this case was a very wide, it was 35 weeks of gestation, very large collection of fluid in the posterior fossa, and we could not tell actually, also if you look at the clip here, I scroll up and down on the three planes and could not see the wall of the arachnoid cyst, but still eventually this turned out to be really an arachnoid cyst of the posterior fossa. So on some occasions, if the walls of the cyst just flat along the walls of the occipital bone, you cannot tell one from the other. So in conclusion, what are the take-home messages for this talk? The concept about the development of the vermis and the cisterna magna are evolving. So come to the White Journal, because a lot of debate is evolving on our journal, luckily, and also another journal, of course. And this is a very thrilling and appealing field to be followed up by you, for those of you who are interested. The first trimester diagnosis, we are getting there, but still we cannot characterize so far the good guys from the bad guys in the posterior fossa. So a follow-up scan for final diagnosis is strongly needed and cannot be avoided. Major posterior fossa abnormalities include the four I mentioned before. And finally, bear in mind that due to the fact that the vermis itself and the cerebellum have a much larger number of neurons overall than the supratentorial brain, as I learned recently, and since all these neurons go everywhere to every part of the cortex, then the prognosis is really unpredictable. You would expect, if you look at the entities in the box, that there would be a significantly or certain risk of neurodevelopment, major developmental delay, But you see also that also in the Walker malformation, in a significant share of the cases, you may have normal neurodevelopmental outcome. And this is due to the fact that we do not know yet the plasticity and the actual relationship between the cerebellar cortex and Vermian cortex and the two supratentorial hemisphere. And I thank you for your attention.